The dock was drifting, and Nadine didn't even realize it. One moment she was raising a wine glass beneath pastel lanterns, the next she was screaming across open water as her stolen party venue floated out into the lake. Thunder cracked overhead, her orchids flew into the waves, and from my porch, dry, calm, and surrounded by lavender, I watched karma set sail. You know, when I bought the cottage at the far edge of Fern Hollow Lake, I wasn't chasing excitement, I was chasing silence. I'd spent 40 years in greenhouses, lecture halls, and botanical symposiums, teaching students how to coax life from soil, explaining the difference between lavender angustifolia and lavandin to anyone who would listen. Retirement for me wasn't about slowing down, it was about finally growing something for myself. My little lavender-lined path down to the lake, the scent of crushed blossoms underfoot, the quiet splash of ducks at dawn, that was the vision. Not conflict. Certainly not a turf war with a woman named Nadine Carlisle, whose perfume alone could knock a bee unconscious, and whose power trip came with HOA letterhead. The dock had been my first big project. The house itself was modest, a two-bedroom, cedar-shingled cottage that had seen better decades, but the lot was gold. Lakefront, undeveloped. I had a vision the minute I saw it, a floating dock big enough for reading fishing, launching my kayak and sipping sun tea while dragonflies zipped past the reeds. I hired professionals, filed every permit with the county, hired a surveyor twice to confirm the boundaries. The dock itself was a beauty, high-density, polyethylene, floats corrosion-resistant, aluminum frame, a composite deck that wouldn't splinter under bare feet. It wasn't just a dock. It was a promise to myself, a hard-earned slice of tranquility. And then came Nadine. Nadine Carlisle, HOA president and self-appointed queen of the cove, lived 5 blocks inland in a beige colonial with a plastic flamingo by the mailbox. She hadn't set foot on the lake without wearing wedge sandals and an attitude. I met her once at the spring meeting briefly. She complimented the color of my garage door, then asked pointedly whether I'd gotten approval for the hue. It was beige, I smiled. She did not. That was the kind of woman she was, an iron fist wrapped in seasonal floral print. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a glossy flyer left on my porch, Summer on the Water, HOA Lake Celebration. Saturday, July 22nd. Barbecue drinks, catered bites, live music. What caught my eye was the phrase, Lakeside Lounge Dock. I raised an eyebrow. There was only one dock large enough on this side of the cove to host such an affair, and it was mine. Surely a mistake, I thought. I emailed Nadine directly, politely but firmly, asking for clarification. No response. A few days later, while watering the lavender rows that framed my gravel path, I saw them. Nadine and 2 of her board members, Bert and Lenora, strolling right onto my property as if it were a park. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They walked past my no trespassing sign, lavender-colored to match the trim just installed last week, and went straight to the dock. I stepped off the porch. "Can I help you?" I asked. Nadine turned, feigning surprise. She gestured with a grand sweep of her hand. "Oh, Margot, we were just admiring this lovely structure. It's perfect for the party, don't you think? So much more ambiance than the old gravel lot." "Excuse me," I said. "This is my private dock. It's not for HOA use." "Oh, come now," she smiled tightly. "The lake belongs to the community. Surely we can share a little shoreline spirit." Bert mumbled something about communal lake access, while Lenora nodded like a bobblehead in a sundress. I held firm. This dock is attached to private land. I paid for it, I maintain it, and it's not available for public events. Nadine's smile faded just a hair. "Well, I think we'll have to agree to disagree. The community deserves to enjoy the lake properly. You've got the nicest view after all. Then maybe the community should have built a dock," I replied, "instead of taking mine." She sniffed, straightened her shoulders, and marched back up the path without another word. I stood there, lavender hose in hand, fuming. That evening, I drafted a formal email addressed to the HOA board and CC'd the neighborhood's general inbox. I outlined the property boundaries, attached scanned copies of the deed, and included a statement that no part of my property, including the dock, was available for public use. I received no response. None. But I did notice a new round of flyers go up the next day, this time listing my actual address, 47 Lavender Bend, as the party location. My address. In print. I nearly dropped the watering can. They weren't just assuming access, now they were advertising it. I started noticing little things. A portable restroom parked across the street, a catering van slowing down as it passed, plastic folding chairs stacked under a tarp near the dock. One morning I found someone stringing paper lanterns along the dock, railing my dock railing, without so much as knocking. Orders from Nadine, the young man said, confused when I told him to remove them. That's when I knew the time for polite pushback had passed. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to get into a shouting match with people who saw property lines as polite suggestions. I was going to let the dock do the talking. I spent the next 2 evenings studying the original blueprints, reviewing the installation specs. I spoke with the construction crew foreman. He remembered me and gave me a few pointers. I learned exactly how to release the shoreline hinge, how to loosen the inner moorings, not to make the dock unstable, just mobile. It was, after all, a floating dock, built to move with the water, built to be temporarily released and stored for the winter. I simply encouraged it to remember that freedom a little early. The lavender was blooming early that year. The scent drifted across the yard as I prepped my tools, gloves, and a small socket wrench set. Just in case, it was quiet work, delicate, precise, and every moment of it I felt my pulse slow, my mind clear. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was reminding them subtly but firmly what boundaries meant. The Friday evening before the party, the dock was prepped, still connected, still anchored, but the hinges were loosened, the shoreline attachment greased and primed. 2 of the 4 heavy anchors near the shore had been released, their chains coiled discreetly on the lakebed. It looked exactly the same as it always had. That night I slept like a woman who'd just planted a field full of consequences, because tomorrow my dock was going to bloom in motion, and Nadine Carlisle, self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was going to find out what happens when you try to take something rooted in lavender and drag it into your little power trip. The morning of July 22nd arrived cloaked in a deceptive calm. The sky was a pale blue wash, the lake still as glass, and the lavender lining my path swayed softly in the breeze, like it hadn't just been enlisted in a cold war over dock space. I stood on my porch at 6:42 a.m., coffee in hand, watching a hummingbird dart between the blossoms, and thought to myself, not for the first time, what a fine day it would be for a birthday. 63 today. No plans for cake or candles, no streamers or banners, just me, a fresh pot of sun tea, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that for once, boundaries were going to be honored, even if I had to teach that lesson myself. By 8:15, the signs of occupation began to arrive. A white catering van rumbled into view and parked at the base of my gravel path, blocking my mailbox like it was a loading dock. Out came tables, trays, linen cloths, a string of paper lanterns in pastel hues, and 2 large coolers labeled adult beverages, HOA use only. I watched them unload with clinical interest, documenting every step with the security cameras I had discreetly repositioned the night before. My lavender plants were already in bloom, a violet haze trailing like a ribbon toward the lake, and I found it bitterly amusing to see these uninvited guests walk that path, utterly unaware they were headed toward the slowest moving ambush in Fern Hollow history. Then came Nadine, clad in a lemon-yellow sundress with ruffled sleeves and a straw hat that looked like it had been lifted from a Southern Belle cosplay catalog. She arrived like royalty surveying her court. With one arm she gestured toward the dock, and with the other she waved toward Lenora and Bert, both of whom were busily assembling what looked to be a champagne station on the far edge. The gall, she hadn't even knocked. By 11:30 a.m., I counted 15 guests and 3 staffers. Music floated on the breeze. A Bluetooth speaker hidden beneath the beverage table was pumping out jazzy yacht rock, the kind of music that pretends to be laid back, but reeks of performative leisure. The paper lanterns fluttered cheerily overhead. A centerpiece of pink orchids and pale lilacs sat in the middle of a long buffet table. Everything looked picturesque, controlled, assumed. That was my cue. I slipped out the side door gloves, tucked in my pocket, hair tied back, and made my way toward the far end of the path where the lavender thinned into rocky shoreline. From that vantage point, I could see the dock clearly, but I stayed low, crouched by the last hydrangea bush. I waited for the music to swell, and for Nadine to raise her wine glass during one of her high-pitched laughs. Then steady hands on the metal ramp hinge I pulled. The pin, pre-loosened and greased the night before, slid free with a soft, metallic sigh. The dock shifted almost imperceptibly, just an inch or two, the kind of movement that might come from a boat wake. I stepped back, heart pounding, not with fear, but with something far more electric, righteous calm. The slow drift began. The two anchor chains I had left intact farther out, harder to reach, offered some resistance, but not enough to stop it. They acted more like sea anchors now, dragging gently along the silty lake bed, guiding the structure away at a regal, deliberate pace. From my position by the lavender, it was like watching a stage set come unhinged. The party guests didn't notice at first. Why would they? The wine was flowing, the shrimp cocktail had arrived, and Nadine was halfway through retelling her story about the HOA wine tasting fundraiser from last year, which involved a charcuterie board, a goat, and an unfortunate misunderstanding with a vegan neighbor. It wasn't until a full 6 feet of water separated the dock from shore that the first ripple of realization hit. I heard a man's voice, probably Ron from Cedar Loop, say, "Wait, are we moving?" Heads turned. Faces squinted. Bert leaned over the edge and squawked something about current and wind. Nadine paused mid-sip and blinked at the growing gap between her and solid ground. It was 11 feet now, then 15. The music kept playing, but the party had shifted. People began to look around, murmur, pull out phones. Some laughed nervously. Others frowned. Then just as the panic began to simmer, nature made her entrance. The breeze stiffened. The clouds rolled in, not from the west as forecasted, but fast and low, from the south, dark and churning. A warning wind gust scattered paper napkins and blew the pastel lanterns sideways. The temperature dropped. The light turned green-gray, and before anyone could say, maybe we should head back, the first fat raindrop splashed onto the buffet table. Then came the storm. Rain slammed down in sheets, turning the dock into a skating rink. Plates clattered, glasses overturned. One of the speakers fizzled out in a pathetic whimper of static. The lilacs in Nadine's centerpiece collapsed like wet confetti. People screamed. One man slipped on a plastic chair, grabbing the catering table on his way down, dragging a tray of bruschetta with him into the lake. Someone shouted, "We need a rope." Another voice, female, probably, Lenora shrieked, "We're adrift." Meanwhile, I stood sheltered beneath the porch awning, dry as my wit, watching the scene unfold like a Greek tragedy written in floral script. My lavender swayed calmly in the wind. The dock drifted farther now, a full 60 feet from shore, rocking harder as the storm escalated. The generator sputtered and died. A gust of wind lifted the tablecloths like sails. I saw Bert desperately clutching the speaker stand, while Nadine clung to the broken centerpiece like a lifeline, her yellow sundress now plastered to her frame, mascara running in rivulets down her cheeks. At some point, someone had the good sense to call 911. The sheriff's lake patrol boat arrived about 20 minutes after the worst of it hit, navigating choppy water and frantically waving arms. They took the partygoers off in groups of 5. Emergency blankets were handed out. Someone vomited. Everyone looked like they just returned from a failed survival retreat. The final head count confirmed that 3 people had fallen into the lake. No injuries, thanks in part to the orange life ring mounted on the dock railing, the one I had personally installed last fall. Even in their chaos, my safety protocols had held. The sheriff's deputy found me on my porch sipping hot tea now that the rain had passed and the lake returned to its placid state. I showed him the documents, the emails I'd sent, the deed, the footage. He nodded slowly, taking notes. Nadine was still yelling something about reckless behavior and endangerment, but it sounded shrill and hollow now. The dock, meanwhile, was towed gently to the community beach and left there crooked and battered for later assessment. A few of the pastel lanterns had tangled into the lavender bushes near the shoreline. I left them there, a reminder like fallen petals after a storm. My dock had spoken, boundaries had been restored, and my birthday. Well, it wasn't what I planned, but it was unforgettable. By the time the last dripping party guest had been ferried off my drifting dock and wrapped in an emergency blanket by the sheriff's lake patrol, the skies had cleared just enough to leave the water glazed with silver and the grass around my porch wet with blown petals and scattered paper lanterns. I stood under the awning arms, crossed a mug of now-cold tea in my hand, watching Nadine Carlisle bark into a cell phone with the same commanding energy she'd used to direct the caterers. Only this time mascara streaks painted her cheeks like war paint, and her once starched sundress clung like a dish rag. She was seething, soaked, and humiliated, though not humbled. I could see it in her posture, spine stiff, lips tight, scanning for someone to blame. I didn't have to guess who she had in mind. Sure enough, 3 days later, a thick white envelope arrived via certified mail. The return address bore the name of a downtown law firm with gold foil lettering and too many vowels. Inside was a multi-page demand letter accusing me of reckless endangerment, willful sabotage, emotional distress, and destruction of property. They blamed me for the weather, the drifting dock, the catering losses, the generator, even a missing centerpiece Nadine described as a cherished heirloom floral installation. I actually laughed at that one. It read less like a legal document and more like a tantrum in Times New Roman. Still, I didn't take it lightly. I called Kelsey Tran the next morning. Kelsey was a former student of mine back when I guest lectured at the university's environmental law clinic. Now she was a razor-sharp civil litigator with a specialty in land rights and an attitude that could melt steel. I forwarded the letter. An hour later, she called back. "This is garbage," she said. "They've got no case, but you've got a beautiful one." And so we filed. Our response was a masterclass in precision, a full rebuttal backed by time-stamped emails, deed records, high-resolution images of the lavender-colored no trespassing signs, and video footage of the dock drifting slowly away before a single raindrop fell. Then we countered: trespassing, private nuisance, property damage, legal fees. And because Kelsey had a flair for the poetic, she included a line about a pattern of HOA overreach culminating in a public act of forced occupation. It was the legal equivalent of composting their arrogance into fertilizer. The discovery phase came quickly. Depositions were scheduled. Kelsey grilled them one by one, her voice calm and clipped like garden shears, pruning lies from overgrown hedges. Bert, the treasurer, broke first. Sweating under the conference room lights, he admitted that they had received my email. Yes, the one where I explicitly said the dock was private property. Yes, the one with the deed attachment. Yes, he remembered seeing it. No, they hadn't responded. Why, he mumbled something about Nadine calling it bluffing. Then came Lenora. Her tone was chipper until Kelsey pulled up a photo of her, standing next to the no trespassing sign with a platter of deviled eggs. "Did you read that sign, Miss Hawkins?" Kelsey asked. "Well, sure," Lenora said. "But we thought it was decorative." Kelsey blinked. "Like your centerpiece." The court reporter snorted. Then it was Nadine's turn. She walked in with her chin high and pearls shining, still trying to summon the dignity of a queen bee, despite the fact her hive had just been smoked. She tried to claim an implied easement, insisting that the dock benefited the community and was therefore functionally communal. Kelsey eviscerated her with the survey maps. "You believed that because the dock was pretty and useful, you had a right to use it." "It was a community celebration," Nadine snapped. "We were bringing joy." "You brought a generator and a chafing dish onto private property," Kelsey replied dryly. "Without permission. After being told no. You turned joy into litigation." Nadine bristled, but the narrative was already crumbling. Even the caterers were deposed and their testimony aligned. They were told by Nadine that I had given permission. One of them remembered my stern gardening look and said he felt uneasy the moment he stepped onto the dock. It all added up. The HOA's claim of endangerment didn't stand up to the weather data. Kelsey had pulled radar records and timestamps showing the storm's rapid escalation after the dock had already detached. No one had been hurt. The only injury was to their pride and their monogrammed wine glasses. Mediation was ordered by the judge, a last-ditch effort to avoid trial. Their lawyer, now noticeably less smug, came to the table with an olive branch. They'd drop the suit if we did the same. Kelsey leaned back in her chair and smiled politely. "Absolutely not," she said. "My client has been harassed, lied to, trespassed against, and smeared in a community where she moved for peace. We're not backing down." They blinked. She continued. "Here's what we want: full reimbursement for dock repairs, professional re-anchoring and replacement of damaged items, payment of all legal fees, a written signed apology from the HOA board to Ms. Linwood, distributed to all residents. And one more thing." She paused. "Community service. 40 hours. Each. Perpetrators only." Their attorney's eyebrows shot up. "You want punitive hours? I want them to weed the HOA's neglected community garden. I think it's time they learned what real community service looks like." The silence that followed was exquisite. After some back and forth, and I imagine a very tense board meeting, they agreed. A formal settlement was signed. Funds were transferred. A printed letter of apology complete with embossed HOA letterhead and Nadine's reluctant signature arrived in my mailbox. And 2 Saturdays later, I stood behind a row of newly planted lilies and watched Nadine, Bert, and Lenora in matching gloves pulling weeds from the HOA's neglected butterfly garden like middle schoolers on detention. Nadine's straw hat was gone, her pearls replaced by a sun visor, her posture for once not stiff with pride, but slumped with quiet defeat. Bert muttered to himself as he bagged leaves. Lenora tried to make small talk with a neighbor who didn't answer. They had been defanged not just in public standing, but in spirit. Their imagined authority had floated away on a storm-tossed dock, and now they were rooted to the dirt like the rest of us. Meanwhile, my dock had been restored professionally, reattached, re-anchored, buffed, and better than ever. The bent railing was replaced. The scratch is gone. And I planted a new row of lilies by the edge, bright white ones, their petals open like a promise. That weekend, I hosted a small birthday picnic 2 weeks late, but worth every minute. Friends gathered, brought homemade pies, and toasted from the dock as the sun set across the water. Bees buzzed among the lavender. The air was still. The lake was calm. And for the first time in months, I felt like Fern Hollow was exactly what I'd hoped it would be, a place where things grow when you give them space. As for Nadine, she finished her service hours and now sits quietly at the back of board meetings, rarely speaking. The HOA newsletter now includes a reminder about respecting private property. And my lavender, it's never bloomed more beautifully. Boundaries once crossed had been redrawn with steel and sunlight. And just beyond them, my dock floated, steady, serene, and entirely unquestionably mine. There's a lesson tucked within the petals of Margot Linwood's lavender, a truth as steady as her dock and as firm as her quiet resolve. Know your rights, protect your peace, and never be afraid to stand your ground, especially when it's legally yours. Margot didn't yell. She didn't escalate with threats or theatrics. She responded with calm clarity, documentation, and a plan rooted in principle. In a world where entitlement often shouts louder than facts, her story reminds us that dignity, preparation, and boundary setting are powerful tools. When her rights were ignored and her property was claimed without consent, she didn't retaliate in rage. She stood firm in truth, backed by evidence, and let the facts do the talking. There's a deep wisdom here. Sometimes the most elegant form of resistance is not confrontation, but consequence. Margot's drifting dock wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a floating message that boundaries matter, both legal and personal. And when those boundaries are crossed, accountability must follow, not through vengeance, but through justice. To those watching or listening today who face similar moments, whether it's a neighbor overstepping a system, ignoring your rights, or an authority figure misusing power, let this story encourage you. You are not powerless. With preparation, support, and courage, you can reclaim your space, your peace, and your voice. And to community leaders and HOA boards out there, true leadership isn't about control, it's about respect. Respect for rules, respect for neighbors, and most of all, respect for the truth. On behalf of the U.S. Justice Story Team, thank you for spending time with us today. We appreciate your open hearts and sharp minds. Every view, every share, every comment helps us bring more untold stories like Margot's into the light. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or pushed aside, remember this tale of lavender lilies and quiet strength. And the next time someone tries to take what's yours, don't just stand up, stand tall. Because sometimes making waves is the only way to protect the shoreline. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay informed, and as always, stay just.